Hi there, let me ask you a question. Are our former leaders still serving the interest of New Zealand, or have they turned away from the very transparency that they once vowed to uphold? Now, in today's episode, we're going to view the question of what happens when responsibility becomes separated from accountability, as we take a look at this aspect of today's culture through the lens of the Bible. Hello, I'm Mike Bain from Christian Voice New Zealand. Thanks for joining me. Now, still living are 8 former New Zealand Prime Ministers, from Sir Geoffrey Palmer through to Chris Hipkins, with Christopher Luxon, yet to join their ranks. And recent refusals by New Zealand's former leaders, Dame Jacinda Ardern, Chris Hipkins, and former Ministers of the Crown, Robertson and Ayesha Verrall, to testify before the Royal Commission into the Covid19 response have reignited debate over their moral duty to public transparency. Now, to be honest, I don't think their refusal has come as any surprise to anyone, but the condemnation and pile-on, as expected, has been quite loud. And no surprise how the media has turned on what Jacinda Ardern claimed when elected her government. Her government would be the most transparent government ever. Do you remember that? Now, the cited refusal by these politicians that convention and concerns over live-stream testimony being misused as reasons not to participate in open hearings, in their eyes, well, it may be a fair call, but it does raise the question, doesn't it, surrounding their moral responsibility to leadership. Many argue that with great privilege comes an even greater duty to the public. Now, in the case of Ardern, as a former head of government, she carries a moral responsibility to demonstrate transparency and answer for her decisions during the pandemic. Public hearings reinforce trust in our institutions, and it shows us that no one is above scrutiny. Now, I want to view the events in the news cycle through a biblical lens which covers the question of morality. Some, of course, would suggest that Ardern turned her back on a Mormon upbringing and embraced a more socialist viewpoint on life, and she would not consider the question for a moment. But imagine for a moment if our leaders were judged by biblical leadership standards. Now, biblical leadership isn't about entitlement, but stewardship, and it highlights the primacy of humble service over privilege. Biblical leadership also underscores a continued responsibility to the public even after leaving office. But, I know, transparency in the question of morality. Transparency nurtures trust. Public testimony models the servant heart. Completing one's duty, having guided the nation through a crisis. Ardern's visible engagement aligns with Romans 13:7's call to give leaders their due honour through accountability. Encouraging and healing. Often open hearings offer closure for those impacted by pandemic policies and reflect the biblical ethic of reconciliation. Hey, but there's none of that in Ardern, nor in Hipkins, Robertson or Verrall. Leadership, whether it's be biblical or not, isn't about entitlement but stewardship, as we mentioned. Matthew 23:11-12 teaches that the greatest among you will be your service. It highlights the primacy, as we mentioned, of humble service over privilege. Luke 12:48 reminds us, from everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded, underscoring a continued responsibility to the public even after leaving office. Scripture affirms honouring leaders who serve faithfully. For example, 1 Timothy 5:17 instructs that those who labour in preaching and teaching deserve double honour, which can extend to the civic leaders receiving financial provision. Romans 13:7 calls us to give to everyone what you owe them. If honour, then honour. And in a civic sense, this can come with an act of communal gratitude. Now, in the case of all the former Prime Ministers we named, apart from Chris Hipkins, they've received honour and recognition from the community and the title which precedes their names. Proverbs 3:27 warns, "Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it's in your power to act," reinforcing a just provision for former leaders. And this is where the question of moral accountability comes to the fore. In New Zealand, as in many other countries around the world, former leaders of nations will receive an annual payment courtesy of the taxpayer. Former Prime Ministers have held one of the most demanding roles in the country. The stipend or payment acknowledges their years of public service and sacrifice. It ensures leaders can maintain a level of dignity and financial stability, reducing the risk of them needing to commercialise their legacy or take inappropriate roles. Now, many ex-Prime Ministers will remain active in diplomacy, advocacy or mentoring. The stipend supports their ability to contribute without financial pressure. Now, paying a former leader is nothing new, as we read in 2 Samuel 5:12 about King David recognised his leadership as a divine appointment. 2 Kings 25:29-30, Jehoiakim received provision in exile. Numbers 18:21, Levite priests were given tithes for their work. Provision is biblical, but privilege without purpose is not. Now, the biblical model doesn't oppose provision. It opposes privilege without purpose. So if a stipend enables continued service, mentorship or advocacy, it aligns with biblical stewardship. But if it fosters elitism or detachment from the people, it veers into dangerous territory. But the biblical pattern also shows that honour is inseparable from accountability. Leaders who refused correction or transparency often lost their standing, their provision, or even their lives. Okay, so let's get down to the dollars and cents. With the exception of Chris Hipkins, who was only in office for less than a year, former Prime Ministers of New Zealand are eligible to receive an annual annuity of up to $57,000 for life. That's $57,000 each year. Now, in addition to this, they also receive a tax-funded car, free domestic and international travel, a generous pension scheme, especially for those who served before 1999. The annuity and travel provisions are reviewed regularly by the Remuneration Authority and adjusted as needed. But to be honest, for some, 57k, well, it may be a small amount in the grand scheme of things, but I'll let you do the math over time. But I am going to be balanced about this. You know, when John Key was Prime Minister, he never received his salary as it was donated to charity. John Key, of course, was a very rich man. Which brings me to our former Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, and the question of transparency and moral obligation. Since leaving office in 2023, Jacinda Ardern has become one of the world's most sought-after keynote speakers. Agency report fees of around US $200,000. That's around about $316,000 in our currency per event. And she regularly headlines global conferences on leadership, climate action and social justice. Now, many argue that with great privilege comes an even greater duty to the public. And as the former head of government, Ardern carries that moral responsibility to demonstrate transparency and answer for her decisions during the pandemic. As I mentioned, public hearings reinforce trust in our institutions, and they show us that no one is above scrutiny. The contrast between modest lifetime stipends and six-figure speaking fees, so spotlights a broad attention. Like, how do we honour former leaders fairly while they are ensuring they remain accountable? A stipend recognises service and preserves dignity, and lucrative speaker incomes reward expertise. But public confidence demands visible engagement, especially when reviewing decisions that shaped millions of lives. Now, as New Zealanders, we reflect on Ardern's post-PM journey. The conversation turns to the heart of democratic stewardship. Should financial provision for former leaders hinge on active public accountability, or must moral obligations extend beyond private cooperation to the very stages where citizens can see and hear directly from what those they once entrusted with the nation's welfare? If moral obligations mirror scriptural mandates, refusal to appear could be seen as neglecting one's public stewardship. In Ezekiel 34, verse 2-4, it condemns leaders who only take care of themselves and ignore their flock. Withdrawal of benefits would serve as a corrective measure, reminding the ex-Prime Ministers that provision is tied to continued public service and transparency. Under a biblical ethic, stipends honour sacrificial leadership, but they're inseparable from ongoing accountability. Jacinda Ardern's post-PM earnings and a decision to avoid public hearings highlight the tension between privilege and service. Balancing provision with moral duty invites a deeper conversation about how faith principles shape civic standards for all our former leaders. Now, if you think former leaders owe us more than personal gain and recognition, speak up. Contact the Royal Commission and your local MP to demand open hearings and full accountability for decisions that have shaped our nation during crisis. Share this analysis with friends and faith communities, calling them to a prayerful reflection on servant leadership and to stand for transparent, scripture-rooted stewardship in public office. Hey, thanks for joining me today. Really, we do look forward to your comments. And as always, whatever way your heart directs, whether it be in prayer or financially, we do appreciate your support. And don't forget to sign up for our free weekly newsletter to arrive in your inbox each Wednesday. You can do this from our website, christianvoicenewzealand.com. Let me just leave you with this thought from the Apostle Paul in his writing to the congregation in Philippi. He said, "And this is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God." Until next time.